A very warm welcome to the students and faculty, and normally the seats will fill up as the time progresses, and we have a very distinguished speaker for a very important and a serious issue which is emerging on the implications of the new technology, which is the artificial intelligence and robotics, and the concern and the concern has been expressed about the employment implication, and also therefore on the macroeconomic and growth stability of capitalism. So how is that if all the functions of human beings are going to be done by robots? How is that now how is that the demand is going to be reproduced? How is the stability of the system is going to be reproduced? How is that, in what ways capitalism is going to restructure itself in terms of the payments and incomes? How do we revisualize the circular flow of incomes in macroeconomy are the bigger questions in mind. And while at a micro level the researchers are looking at each industry, like medicine, like industry, like manufacturing, automobiles, etc. So today we have Professor Anthony DCosta, who had been working on automobile. In one of his areas is the automobile sector also. I invite him to the dais. And I invite Professor Rajshekhar, our Pro Vice Chancellor, who will preside the lecture. I will invite Professor Naresh Sharma, the Dean Social Sciences. Sorry, Economics. We still are in the habit of being part of social sciences. I hand over the proceedings to Professor Rajshekhar.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the distribution. Theme of the day is the long ways and the changing techno-economic paradigms, future of work in Indian automotive industry. So just now, my colleague Kondratieff spoke about the impact of artificial intelligence and robotics on employment opportunities. So before we proceed further, I request Professor Naresh Sharma, the Dean of School of Economics, to welcome the gathering.
Professor Rajshekhar, our Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor Anthony DCosta, Professor Raman, other colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, very warm welcome to all of you, and especially to our special guest today, Professor DCosta. We are really very happy to have you among ourselves. Our actually session has just begun. Our teaching program just 3 days back we have started. So students are coming back to the campus. They are, I think, getting re-acclimatized to the campus greenery from wherever they are coming. So as Professor Raman said that people will be coming by and by. But I am excited by the title that you have chosen. That I am sure that we are going to have a very, very interesting talk, and especially in the more recent times. See, what used to be said about the Western countries, that automotive industry somewhere drives the economy. For last few decades, it has been sort of thing said about this, that what is happening there does show that how economy is doing. And even today people talk about what is happening, it is decelerating and all those kinds of things are being said today. So the topic certainly is an exciting topic, and obviously you are going to take a long view. If you are talking about long waves, that it has to take long view. And we have in economics people who come from technical background, including I in my previous avatar was a engineering student. Professor Rajshekhar is engineering graduate as well. So we have several engineering people here. So we will certainly look forward to that how you classify them into paradigms different. Now, I am joining everybody from my school to welcome you here, and my Pro-Vice Chancellor. I also like to maybe say a few words about my school, okay. Maybe a couple of minutes. The university was set up in 1974, and we started as a Department of Economics in the School of Social Sciences, set up in 1978. But economics program in some sense started even before that. Our first student is recorded to have joined in 1975 in MPhil economics program. From that small beginning, we have grown quite a bit. In 2012, we became School of Economics. So we have this structure, the way School of Economics can have subunits, schools can have subunits, which are departments and centers. So we are earlier in the School of Social Science, and now we are School of Economics. We had MA in Economics program. Now we have 2 master's programs. MA in Economics continues, and it has grown from less than 30 students at one time to nearly 70 to 75 students we get to the program. And we have added another master's program called MA in Financial Economics, which is in terms of students half the size of MA in Economics program. This is a very young program, and we are still stabilizing that program. In between, in 2006, we started 5-year integrated program, master's program in economics. So, besides these programs, we also have MPhil and PhD programs in economics. And nearly 125 to 150 students we have as research scholars with MPhil and PhD programs, and more than 200 students in our various master's programs we are having. We have about 21 faculty members as of now, and we are expecting that more faculty members will be joining in the next 6 months to 1 year. We have variety of interests in our faculty, and we also offer variety of programs. We have political economy courses, as well as a very strong team which specializes in political economy approach to the analyzing, understanding the problems. We have, of course, macroeconomics and macro monetary. We have very strong monetary economists here. We have financial economics people. We have people who work in the area of, say, economics of discrimination, economics of environment and natural resource, ecology sometimes also touch upon. Then in the social side, we have people who work in economics of education, economics of health, okay. And then, of course, in quantitative area, there are many people who are good in quantitative economics. They may not be often discovering new techniques, but they are mastering techniques and using them in application of economics in large number of areas. In courses in all these areas, as well as we have courses in law and economics, social choice theory, okay, game theory, and so on and so forth. So, we feel very happy that we offer a sort of menu to the students, where they can have in fact, a long view that how the economic discipline has evolved over time. So, the historical context is not lost upon them, but we do not force and compel everyone to do that. Because you know that people have different orientation and different kind of interests, and so on and so forth. So, like in science, some people will become scientists, some people will become engineers, some people will be technicians, and each one of them are valuable to the society. It is not that the one is higher than the other, not in that sense, but they have different kinds, different values they add. Okay. So, in that sense, we do offer a variety of things to our students, and our alumni, not only they go to education institutions, they have gone to the administrative institutions, including government institutions, development institutions, NGOs, corporate sector, besides, of course, various education institutions and higher research institutions in India as well as abroad. Okay. With these few words, I will not take too much of time about the School of Economics, okay, and I once again welcome and look forward to your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rajesh Kumar Sharma. our economist is the vibrant school, as he said. And also the another important issue is you can enter the MBA program with any graduation. Like BTechs also can enter economics program. That's where they have a lot of diversity in the class itself. Now I request Professor Ramamurthy to introduce the speaker.
Privileged to introduce Professor Anthony DCosta. Professor Anthony DCosta is an Indian American, and I was curious to know his name. He's a Bengali, and he said it's a legacy of the Portuguese that they inherited Portuguese culture also. In fact, that was some education to me when I met him 5 years back. He is an eminent scholar in global studies and professor of economics at University of Alabama, Huntsville. Most recently, he was the chair and professor of contemporary Indian studies and director of development studies at University of Melbourne. Prior to this, he was the AP Moller-Maersk Professor of Indian Studies, Copenhagen Business School, and a professor of contemporary international development at University of Washington. He has written extensively on political economy of steel, auto, and IT industries, covering themes of capitalism, globalization, development, innovations, and industrial restructuring. He has written 3 books, edited 10 books with solo and with others, published about 25 articles in reputed international journals, and published 20 articles in international publications in books, and written about 19 book reviews, and he's on the editorial board of 3 journals and 4 book publishers, and he's given about 175 invited lectures in 18 countries. Obviously the time will not be sufficient to go through the details, so therefore we'd only take a sample, like I will cite some books which he has published. Of his 12 volumes, his most recent books are After Development Dynamics, South Korea's Contemporary Engagement with Asia, edited book, Oxford University Press, International Mobility and Global Capitalism and Changing Structure of Accumulation, Transforming the Japan-India IT Relationship, published by Routledge in 2016, The Land Question in India, State Disposition and Capitalist Transition, published by Oxford University Press in 2017, and Changing Contexts and Shifting Roles of the Indian State, The New Perspectives on Development Dynamics, which is a very recent publication by Springer in 2019. Both books co-edited with Achin Chakrabarty. He also edits Dynamics of Asian Development book series. He has held several fellowships, including Fulbright Hayes, American Institute of Indian Studies, Korea Foundation, AB of Japan Foundation, and POSCO at East-West Center. He has taught at the University of Washington, Copenhagen Business School, National University of Singapore, Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, and Bordeaux École de Management. I hope the French would pardon me for my pronunciation of this. And so we are extremely privileged to have Professor Anthony, who has published so extensively on this, and I will not stand between you and the speaker, and thank you.
Thank you. Now I request Professor Anthony to deliver distribution.
Thank you very much to all of you, but certainly to the Pro Vice Chancellor, the Dean, and of course my good friend and colleague Professor Ramanamurthy, and along with my fellow colleagues, Vijay I think is here somewhere, and others. And also to the students who are here. There's always an opportunity cost involved when you attend a lecture. So the question is, what else will you do during this time if you were not here? I don't know, but so thank you for coming as well. This is a very exploratory type of a presentation. My own ideas are not quite consolidated, but I'm willing to sort of venture into some unknown areas. Unknown precisely because they haven't happened. So in some ways, although if we are not looking back so much as we are looking forward, so I don't know what is the word. For the past, of course, you would say counterfactuals, but for the future, I don't know what is the word for it. But I'm obviously looking ahead in some ways, trying to sort of tease out some implications about certain things, and particularly on the issue of employment. It's also very interdisciplinary, so I do have a problem, or rather many people have a problem with me, that to economists I'm not an economist, and to non-economists I am an economist. So it's not it could be a very happy sort of place, but on the other hand, it need not be, right? It all depends who your audience is. But I'm basically very interdisciplinary in my approach. I'm a political economist by training, and a lot of my training has been in development studies. But my development studies is a little bit different from most people in the sense that I am a structuralist in some ways, but also look at business. So I use often business as a lens to look at various problems. Now, let me just sort of move on. The title, yes, it is the understanding of long waves. For some of you, this may be something new if you haven't quite read this literature. So let me just sort of first quickly, I won't go through the outline. I hope this is visible to you. So I'll present a framework, which is really a framework that has been developed by a number of different types of scholars, but that looks at kind of 50-year cycles of the world economy, right? And then place the automobile industry in this sort of discussion of these cycles, these 50-year cycles. I'll cover a little bit of the Indian sort of labor market, which is very familiar probably to most of you. So I won't spend too much time, but we'll just have to touch upon some data to understand what the Indian labor market is like. And of course, within that, changing labor markets also have implications for inequality, which of course is a very hot topic these days. So I'll briefly touch upon that as well. And then finally, I want to look at the automotive industry itself at the global level, and perhaps the kind of different scenarios that we might be able to sort of look into for the Indian sort of automotive industry. So there's a global level, and then there is an Indian level. And in all of this, of course, I will be using some concepts about late industrialization and so on and so forth. For the sake of time, I think that if there are any clarificatory types of questions, you're welcome to ask me on the spot. I'll try to keep it brief, and I'm hoping you'll keep it brief, but then that way I can finish up sooner than later, and then we can have a Q&A. Okay. So the key issues, and my motivation for doing this is that I participate in a very dedicated group of automobile industry researchers. They are based out of Paris, but so there are a lot of Europeans involved. And like as the dean said that, we study Western countries through their automobile industry. Well, they do, and they are very serious engagement with the industry. It's actually an association that they have, and I've been participating over the last few years. So the most recent one was held in Paris in June, which I went to, and the last year was held in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and before that again Paris and so on. So I went to the Paris one this time in June, and their sort of conference theme was Paradigm Shift with a question mark, the automotive industry in transition. So that was the kind of title of that conference. So in that sense, I was inspired by the title itself to think about some of these issues. The other, of course, is the motivation was that I actually read a lot during my graduate school days, which I did my PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, which was the center of steel making. And of course, but then when I was there, it was just the opposite. The steel industry was disappearing. So there, of course, I read, and during that time, industrial policy was a very hot topic in the 1980s. And so I read that, and along with that, I read a lot of literature around long waves, because long waves was presenting us with a framework that allowed us to understand industrial change on a very large scale. So in other words, what was going on was the question about changing industries and what was driving those industries. So for that, I read the so-called long wave. So I have some background in the long wave literature. I've read a few recent pieces, and then, of course, the motivation being the conference itself in Paris. So the main thing to think about conceptually, and that is that long waves actually are driven by a cluster of technologies. So it's not a singular technology that drives it, but rather a cluster of technologies. And we'll see in a few moments, what they might be. And they work in tandem. Now, the thing is that these technologies are often independently developed, but at other times they are developed simultaneously with the knowledge of the other technology. So in other words, there is a certain reinforcement effect. One leads to the other, and in the end, it acts as a cluster, which then pushes the entire economic cycle forward in some ways. But these economic cycles, as you know, the meaning of cycle means that if it goes up, it must also come down. So that's pretty much what is the dynamic of this, and capitalism is such a system whereby there are ups and downs. Sometimes the downs are very severe, other times less so. We're not quite sure, although some people would argue that the downs have become more severe and of shorter cycle. But I'm not going to get into that argument. So these cycles represent, each cycle represents what is in the literature called Techno-Economic Paradigm. So it's not just technology, but there's economics, there's institutional stuff, political stuff, all rolled into one, or technosphere, which is another label for it. And it's a system-wide sort of change that we witness in terms of technology, products, institutions, policy, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole range. So it's a question of, in some ways, mapping out, if you will, of all these different things. And if you're talking about new technologies, it means that there is always this question about the diffusion process. How does diffusion of new technologies take place? Now, obviously, diffusion is not a very straightforward process, at least at the society level, because there are many variables, intervening variables, that may impede or that may facilitate this diffusion process. And I won't go too much into it, but there are what we call drivers and there are barriers. Okay, let's leave it at that. The next issue is late industrialization. Now, for this, I probably will not have the time to go deep into this notion of late industrialization. But as a shorthand, let's simply say that we are referring to late industrialization as those countries that have entered the industrial sort of trajectory much later than the early industrializers. Now, there are obviously early industrializers are also a heterogeneous group. We can differentiate between England and Germany and the United States, France and so on, and then Japan. But then among late industrializers, we can also differentiate by the different degrees of lateness and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of work to be done, and this is something that I'm actually, well, if I have that option or opportunity, I like to work more on this in the future, but not immediately. But this is something that I have been using, the notion of late industrialization, and it's also used in the literature, but it may mean different things. But the main thing about late industrialization is that they are at a different rhythm of absorption and adaptation of technologies. So they have a very different capacity, and they also have the opportunity, in some instances, of leapfrogging. So they don't need to go through the exact path as the early industrializing countries have. So for example, I mean, when I was growing up in India, a telephone was a luxury. And most of the time, the telephones did not work. Okay? But we skipped that entire telephone phase of the landline system and moved very, very quickly into cellular phone systems. Right? So there was almost a skipping of a stage, so to speak. So some individual technologies, yes, there is some kind of leapfrogging, and we can see that also in the automotive industry. And finally, of course, I want to say that it's a very speculative kind of presentation. So obviously, a lot of things have not happened. Some things are happening in the West. There is a lot of hype about certain things. So the question, of course, is that we really don't know what might happen in India, but we can, of course, come up with some scenarios whereby, especially based on what we understand about India, and then therefore sort of imagine what kind of changes can be anticipated. Okay. So let's quickly go through long waves, kind of an idea of long waves. Now, long waves, as you can see, they are also known as, by the way, Kondratieff cycles. So Kondratieff was this Russian economist who was asked to study basically Western capitalism or capitalism in general, and the vantage point being the former Soviet Union. And he studied prices, movements of prices, and so on, coal consumption, et cetera, et cetera. And he basically said, look, I mean, it seems that the capitalist economy moves in these long cycles. Now, a lot of people are somewhat skeptical of this regularity of these cycles, but we don't have time to discuss that. I mean, I'm sure we can debate this, but a lot of people have agreed that indeed there are long cycles, and they're known as K waves or Kondratieffs. And you can see there's first Kondratieff, second, third, et cetera, et cetera. Now, starting point, okay, that varies depending on whose work you're looking at. But if they adopt this framework, long wave framework, you know, they basically start pretty much in the 18th century, all right? Pretty much start in the 18th century and then move on. The periodization is different for different things, but more or less they fall into these categories. So we could say that we are now in the 6th Kondratieff at the moment, all right? So the capitalist economy is somewhere here, and you know, so it has come down. So this is probably like maybe 2008 thereabouts, financial crisis, etc. And of course, I have simply extended the line with a question mark because I don't know whether there will be an upswing yet or not, or what kind of an upswing it would be. But this is how to look at it. Now, if you look at the steam engine, textile industry, clothing in the 18th century as the drivers of the economy, railroad, steel, mass transport, you know, electrotechnology, chemical industry, mass consumption. So you can see that even the markets are changing as the technologies, key technologies are changing. Now, I have highlighted here automobile. So automobile is actually part of the 4th Kondratieff. So automobile is not something new, but something it was already there for quite some time. All right, automobile, petrochemical industry, and of course leading to individual mobility. So this is the kind of market, if you will. So individuals are moving, mobility is what we talk about. Now, if you move to the 5th Kondratieff, I have circled information technology, right? Now, the interesting thing is that today the automobile is basically, well, I don't know about, I used to study the Indian automobile industry, and when I started, the Maruti basically was Maruti 800 was like basically a tin box, all right? So obviously, the insides might have changed, and there are better engines now, and so on and so forth. But today, many cars, even Indian cars made by Suzuki and others, will have a lot of computers in those cars and a lot of software in those cars. So it's very much information technology driven, and of course there are these foreign-made, multinational-made cars that are sold in Western markets. They obviously would have many more computers within the cars. Now, of course, these computers, I mean chips, a lot of software, and that sort of thing. So it's driven by information, all right? So it's a combination then of old sort of product, if you will, or old technology, which is of the 4th Kondratieff, combined with information technology of the 5th Kondratieff. But let's come to the 6th Kondratieff, and this is the thing, because electric vehicles are becoming, well, they're being promoted as a solution to certain things. So you need to have battery technology. And this is, of course, a very, very, and so it's a kind of an energy source, if you will, and battery technology is going to determine significantly to the diffusion process of electric vehicles. So obviously there are a lot of companies, in fact, some governments, engaged in the research and development of batteries. Now, battery, of course, is one kind of solution. The other solution, of course, is hydrogen, but hydrogen is still not quite there. Hydrogen, of course, would be the best because you're not going to be really using, because to have batteries and to recharge them, you still need electricity. And then the question becomes, where does your electricity come from? Does it come from coal? Does it come from some other resource? So there are some questions about that. So there are other alternative technologies and to generate sort of, if you will, mobility, and that is the hydrogen. So hydrogen is perhaps seen as one of the most important, but still very, very difficult to develop commercially. So the carrier technology, I mentioned carrier technology or clusters of technologies. Obviously, these things act as kind of a carrier technology, and of course, what kind of employment implications will they have is the question, and that's what I'm sort of looking into. This is a very similar type of Kondratieff cycle, except that this is for the internet sort of sector. So the internet is obviously part of a much later Kondratieff cycle. And here also you see that it comes down, goes up. And I don't need to go into all of this, but it's quite clear that there is a certain kind of economic crisis, and then of course it comes up. And the pattern is cyclical. Okay? And this is basically in the case of the internet. So you do have a phase where there is innovation. So this is a phase where there's some new technology or a cluster of technologies sort of take shape. And then there is a consolidation phase, which means that markets will slow down, but the technologies will be consolidated. So, but it's very much patterned after the typical Kondratieff cycle, goes up, and then obviously extension of it means it would come down, all right? So the questions then, of course, is that, yes, I'm not debating the length and the periodicity of waves. I'm simply accepting that there are long swings of economic activity. And of course, each swing has its own set of dynamics. And there are, and I've highlighted just a few things. Of course, there is iteration, trial and error iteration, conflicts, negotiation, but institutional responses. So it's not mechanical. I don't want to suggest this whole thing is very mechanical, but rather there's constant intervention of one sort or the other, whether it be by the state, whether it be by the society, whether it be political forces. There are all kinds of institutional responses in this changing sort of techno-economic paradigm. There's the other thing to remember also is that there is an overlap between two Kondratieff cycles. So just as I have shown that automobiles is not something new, we still have the automobiles, but today's automobiles are quite different from the earlier automobiles. So in other words, the product has undergone considerable changes, not to mention also the infrastructure that goes along with it. So there is an overlap between the different cycles, so that it's never a complete break. Now, obviously, over a long period of time, there is a complete break. So, for example, we don't have the horse buggy anymore, other than for entertainment, tourism purposes, right? We don't have it. So that's completely gone. But within 2-3 Kondratieff cycles, there is an overlap, all right? So that's, again, a very intuitive and a simple way to understand how technological change takes place. It's not quite that dramatic or rapid, but obviously it takes a little bit of time. But the other thing, of course, to understand is that because the diffusion process is different for different places, it also means that there is going to be uneven and therefore unequal forms of development in a global way. So spatially, there's going to be a lot of uneven development. So this automobile industry is very similar. India has an automobile industry, and so do many other countries. But the type and the quality of the automobile industries in the different places are actually quite different. So let's look at very quickly the transition of the auto in rich and poor countries. Now, the question, of course, is there a paradigmatic shift, or to put it another way, in the language of the K waves, is there a new techno-economic paradigm? That's the question, right? So the issue, of course, is this notion of transition, and of course, the question mark suggests tentativeness. So even the organizers of that Paris conference, they were also not sure, because they're saying, yeah, we can see these changes might take place, some have taken place, but we don't know if the others will take place. So there's a certain tentativeness in that sort of shift. And of course, transition means lots of different forms of transition, because there are different moving parts in this entire system. Some things may move very, very quickly. Other things will move very, very slowly. So the net effect will be something quite different. So we do have different sort of speeds, different parts of the techno-economic system. So to give you an example, you can have the availability of electric vehicles. EVs are for electric vehicles, but poor power infrastructure for charging. So it's actually very easy to make electric vehicles. It's not difficult, right? But the question, of course, is that how does it get diffused throughout the society? Well, if you cannot provide stable power and, of course, charging stations, then your electric vehicles will have very limited utility in the society. All right. The other, of course, the other case would be that you have power, let's say, but the power is dependent on fossil fuel. Now, remember, electric vehicles are designed precisely to address the problem of pollution. But then the thing is that if you start relying on more electricity generated by coal to power your electric vehicles, then there is a little problem there. In other words, it's not consistent with that. So you can have, and of course, it is a question of cost. So for India, for example, coal is still the cheapest source of power. So the question, of course, is at what point will India give up the coal and move to something else, even though it may already be introducing electric vehicles. So there are different parts moving at different speeds. And additionally, of course, as I said, structurally, the late industrializing countries are different from the early industrializing countries, without getting too involved in those labels. But let's say the US and Japan or Germany versus India, Brazil, and so on. Okay. Now, the other dimension, of course, is if you look at it, so I'm bringing again those Kondratieff cycles, but from a slightly different source. Pretty much the ideas are the same. And here, third to fourth wave, which is the K wave or K cycle, from 1916 to 1970, you have mass production. Now, mass production was adopted by many industries. Mass production simply means that you produce in volumes where you gain the benefits of economies of scale, which means then your cost per unit falls very dramatically. So mass production is a very, very important aspect to production, right? In fact, if you look at why China produces virtually everything that the world needs, is because of mass production. They have fine-tuned the process of making anything and everything on a very large scale. All right, so mass production. But mass production was best instituted in the automobile industry. So if you remember, there was a saying that you had a choice of a car, a Ford car, as long as it was black. Which means that was all they produced in large quantities. And so the cost would have come down, all right? So there is a certain Keynesian element in this mass production system, which means that there are consumers behind it, behind mass production. So mass production also means that it is not elitist consumption, all right? So there's obviously a diffusion of products and consumption as well, all right? So this is part of the third and the fourth sort of wave. Now, in the fourth and the fifth wave, 1970 and extended into the future, we have basically deregulation. So here, New Deal is very much a Keynesian kind of approach, whereas deregulation is just the opposite, which means that you let the markets supposedly do their job, which means that it will be a self-regulating kind of a system. So deregulation, but that also has many implications. One of them, of course, would be on employment. One of them would be also on in terms of what you produce and so on and so forth. So here's mass production, Keynesian demand-based employment. So under mass production, there was a lot of employment. Ford's $5 a day, which he gave $5 to his workers, with the idea that the workers themselves would become consumers, right? And of course, you have deregulation. Now, under deregulation, we have various forms of precarious employment, even in the rich countries or the early industrializing countries, but we'll come to that in a minute. So the reference point for us then is this technological revolution in the rich countries. It's basically the fourth Kondratieff from 1908 onward, age of oil, the automobile, and mass production. So this is a reference point. And internal combustion engine was the sort of main sort of, if you will, the key or the core technology within the automobile industry at the time. Internal combustion. Of course, the engine has been, improved a lot and obviously more efficient and so on. What it needs, of course, if you're going to have mass production of automobiles, you also need networks of roads and highways. So that's your kind of infrastructural requirement. And of course, interestingly enough, you also have electricity, which emerged at the time, mainly for industry and homes. But now we are also realizing that in the sixth Kondratieff, electricity will also become even more important if the automotive industry goes in this battery sort of way. Unless, of course, as I said, if there's a hydrogen type of a engine, okay, hydrogen-based engine. Okay, so these are all overlapping sort of areas, as you can see, different. Now, in the late industrializing countries, such as, say, India and other countries, roads and highways, India still trying to play this catch-up game on the infrastructural side. In other words, it has to build more and more roads. So it's building these roads and highways much later than when it was being introduced in some of the rich countries, when there was the emergence of a very big automobile industry. So India is playing this catch-up game on the infrastructural side of things, all right? If we take the same diagram again, so we have fourth Kondratieff, all of this new technologies and new or refined industries, where computers have already come into the picture, software, etc. And then if you look at new or redefined infrastructures, obviously digital telecommunications are the new infrastructures, internet and so on. And of course, you have this techno-economic paradigm, which is sort of a combination of things. Now, there are many things that one could talk about. I don't have the time, but the one thing I will say is that increasingly we have more sort of production on the basis of economies of scope. So economies of scope is different from economies of scale. Okay, economies of scope is that it allows a certain set of assets to be used for a limited number of products, and what it allows you to do, of course, is to vary your products significantly. So it's very different from buying a black car. You could buy a red car, you could buy a green car, you could buy a pink car, and so on. So there won't be too many red cars, there won't be too many pink cars, but you can do all of those things. And of course, the production system also changes. So in the automobile industry, this is very, very well known as the flexible production system. So that's known as economies of scope. So it's not scale. So in other words, it customizes to some extent the demand in some ways, all right? So this is the sixth Kondratieff, of course, and under the sixth Kondratieff, we have internal combustion engine, networks of roads, electricity, information. Now, internal combustion engine, networks of roads, and electricity are part of the old Kondratieff cycles. Then comes information at a later Kondratieff cycle. Market niches has to do with your economies of scope, which means that you're catering to particular market segments, not a large market by itself, right? And you have globalization. So globalization, now globalization is nothing new. It's just that the kind of globalization that we have since the beginning of the 1980s, around the 1980s, is a very different sort where the international economic integrations becomes very, very strong. The networks become very, very strong, and those who are participating, that is. So India has not been a very important participant in this kind of global integration in the way, say, East Asia has been. But it's in the sixth Kondratieff cycle that we are talking about the so-called electric vehicles, the EVs, all right? So you can see that over different cycles, the technologies are changing, but some of the old things are being sort of invented or reorganized. And combining with the new technologies, new products are emerging. And the automotive industry, in that sense, is very, very similar. Now, late industrialization, now this is where a little bit of political economy comes in. So I mean, I know it looks like a very complicated diagram, but it isn't. But let me just sort of quickly say that in countries like India, late industrializing countries, this is a major sort of issue. In other words, India has not had the traditional type of agrarian transition, all right? So in other words, lots of people engaged in agriculture with very, very low levels of productivity, low wages, and so on, all right? Even though there has been a certain kind of diversification in agriculture to non-agricultural activities, but basically, India has this legacy of a very large population. In other words, India has not gone through the Lewisian sort of turn. Arthur Lewis, as you know, talked about how you should get rid of the surplus people out of the countryside into the cities. That hasn't quite happened. It has happened, but not obviously to a considerable extent. So in other words, there's a lot of surplus people still in the economy. The other, of course, is there, and this is very much a Nehruvian type of kind of approach, but predating in Indian independence, is that there were businesses that emerged in pre-independent India, and those businesses, the big family businesses, they became stronger and powerful under the sort of nationalist kind of development program. So there's a certain kind of capitalist maturity, which is there. So in other words, on the one hand, you have a very sort of low wage based, low income based sector in the countryside, and perhaps even in the urban areas, which is basically surplus people, as we would call it. And then you also have a very small but a fairly mature capitalist sector, right? So you have that, and the state has played a very important role in that development. And this is, of course, a very a significant feature of the Indian economy, along with many other developing countries, is that there is a persistence of the petty commodity production. In other words, this is a sector which supposedly, historically, disappears with economic growth. All right? But we find that this is really persistent. So, if you take these three things, and this is for the late industrializing country, you basically have this uneven development, dualism, enclave development, whatever labels you want to use, this is what you have. This lower part is actually what is just a representation, schematic representation of the advanced capitalist countries. So they obviously solve this problem, whatever means, they solve this problem. This persistence of petty commodity production disappears, and you basically have the state and the very mature capitalist sector. So while this is fairly linear, this one is kind of non-linear. In other words, there's a simultaneity of these things. All right? That's all I would say, because, I mean, we can talk a lot more with this diagram. Now, let's take that circle that I made in the previous slide, and we look at it here. Informal sector, low productivity, etc., precarious sector. And here you have the capitalist maturity, many globally oriented firms. Good quality jobs they have good quality jobs, but not enough, and under pressure due to rising capital intensity. So this is the other peculiar feature of late industrialization, that normally when you have lots of labor, your typical intuitively, or even theory would inform you that, well, if you have so much labor, you've got to use labor. That's your abundant resource. But in a country like India, and many others as well, it's not true necessarily that a lot of labor is being used by modern industry. They are not. In fact, the modern industry, being that they are modern, they are introducing all kinds of new technologies and so on. So it's very, very difficult to create a lot of jobs already because of rising capital intensity, automation, and the other thing, which is a product of the neoliberalism, is the informalization of the formal sector. So people are being laid off, they're made into permanent workers, are being made into contract workers, and temporary workers, and so on and so forth. So this is not a uniquely Indian process. It's happening in lots of other places. So there is an acute demand for decent jobs in India. Now, I came across this statistic that about 19 million workers are in the Indian automobile industry, but only 1 million are employed directly. So in that sense, the automobile industry is not that huge as we think, but partly because the automobile industry requires a long chain of suppliers, all kinds of suppliers, right? So a lot of that employment is here. Now, many recent studies have shown that these workers over here, that is in the supplier industry, they are very, very precarious types of workers. Why? Even in the so-called formal, organized sector where there are permanent employees, I have seen on the shop floor 2 types of workers doing the same job. And their only distinction is that they're wearing different colored uniforms. And one is doing exactly the same job as the other, but one of them is a permanent employee of the company, and the other is contract workers. And their wage scales are different. So that's a kind of a informalization of the formal work, if you will. All right, so that's what's going on in this sort of, if you're thinking about employment implications in the Indian sort of scenario. Now, in this case, of course, what we find is that, I don't want to get too much into it, but this is a very stylized way of presenting, India's sort of rising inequality at different phases. So initially, the world capitalist economy determined India's economy, because India was a colony, right? Then, after it becomes independent, it tries to insulate itself from the world economy through various measures. And then, of course, with deregulation, it begins to engage with the world economy. But in these sort of phases, 3 different phases, you can actually see, and of course, yes, there isn't precise, robust data, but one thing you do see is that there are many more rich today in the reform, post-reform phase, many more rich today, but also at the same time, the inequality has increased, all right? And there are good reasons for it. All you have to do is understand the basic dynamic of what Piketty says in terms of why the rich get richer, all right? So in India also that is the case, although there are many other reasons for it as well, but this is a stylized way of looking at India's sort of trajectory. If you look at inequality, so this is based on Chancel and Piketty, and it's available on the website in the World Inequality Report. You'll be able to, it's on the website, you can get it. And you can clearly see, so both China and India, interestingly enough, they're the higher income groups, the really top income groups, they are growing massively. Okay? They're growing massively. In fact, India actually has the worst record of all these four countries, if you look at, even higher than China at this level. But on other levels, of course, China does worse in terms of income and wealth distribution. Okay, so inequality is growing. Deregulation has taken place. And we are on the 6th Kondratieff. So those are the three basic things now we have in front of us. All right. I've already talked about the persistence of the informal sector in India. So this is where it stands, more or less. In other words, it doesn't seem to disappear or become smaller, right? Because with growth, and India has been growing, in fact, a lot of times we hear this very sort of proud commentary that, oh, we are the highest growing country. But obviously, there's something going on whereby the informal sector or the petty commodity producer is just not reducing. Now, if you look at some of this data, and I'm sure you're familiar, but all I want to say is that if you look at this last column, is basically the employment elasticity. All right. Now, employment elasticity, of course, is measuring that on 1% growth, what is the percentage change in employment? That's the simple elasticity kind of ratio. And you see that it's very low, and in some cases even negative. Obviously, there are some industries that are job displacing ones, and there are some sectors that have been employing, creating growth. Well, this is not very recent data. Okay, it's based on Kannan and Ravindran, but it does give you the sense, because I mean, during this phase, India's growth rates were, yes, they had increased, they were at a higher level, but not to the extent that it would start leading to this kind of employment elasticity. So what's happening then in India is that economic growth is being decoupled from employment growth. Okay, so that's basically what's going on here. Now, if you look at, let's say, the ratio of growth in the fixed capital of the different types of sectors, and you look at the growth in the ordinary workers, and you look at the growth in the output, you can see that output is growing pretty well. So this is your economic growth, if you will. So output is growing pretty well. Fixed capital is also kind of growing, but in lots of cases, you find that the growth in the ordinary workers, which means employment, which means changing in the labor markets, is not growing as much, except for, like, and I've highlighted motor vehicles, because motor vehicles, of course, has been growing, as you can see. Fixed capital, it is a very capital intensive industry. And of course, you can see that the output also has been growing quite a bit. So the question, of course, is that, yeah, some industries are growing, but they're not creating as many jobs. Now, that's because of rising capital intensity, but also because the labor market are changes taking place in the form of more unorganized or informal workers in the formal workplaces. So that's another reason why you don't see that kind of employment growth. And so another sort of source for employment elasticity, you find that over the years from 1970 right through 2011-12, pretty much, you can see it's very low, the employment elasticity, right? You can see it's very, very low. Obviously, different phases will have different sort of reasons for it. And also, these are fairly at the aggregate level. So, we may not have a singular explanation for this. But one thing is very clear, that India's growth is not employment intensive. I mean, that picture is very, very, very clear, no matter how you want to look at it. So that provides the kind of context about understanding employment implications, especially in this automotive industry, if we are going to make the assumption, based on whatever changes that we witness today, that the automobile industry is becoming more automated or more capital intensive. What does it mean then for employment? Okay, so employment implications under different scenarios. Now, we all know, and I'm sure many of you will be looking for jobs after you graduate. What jobs will you get? You don't know, because the market is sort of soft, unless, of course, you have a very specific type of skill that the market demands. But the problem, of course, is that, and especially for universities do not know what they should focus their energies on. Very, very difficult task. I mean, the US universities are constantly talking about it. Well, what should we do? What does the market want? But what the market wants is not fixed. It's always changing, right? So that's an issue. But in the case of India, and this is based on Ajit Ghosh's 2016 report on employment, that is the India Employment Report of 2016, there were some interesting figures. First of all, here's the challenge. Now, this will throw any country, off the works, because to create 12 million new jobs every year just to absorb the growth in the labor force. Now, 12 million jobs is not a small matter, right? How do you create those jobs? Okay. Now, so that's a very interesting question over here. They, of course, they have a figure like 16 million jobs to create annually. That is Ghosh. They point out, based on their calculations, that we need to create 16 million jobs annually for the foreseeable future, of which about 7 million will be medium skilled. Okay, they have arrived at, by whatever methods they have used, under rising productivity. So now remember, it's not just a matter of employment, you also have to have increasing productivity, because productivity in the end leads to growth. Okay? So the question then is, how do you manage growth while at the same time absorbing labor? When we know that thus far, growth seems to be decoupled from employment. Okay, so that's one sort of major dilemma. So they say that need 8% growth for the foreseeable future. Okay, 8%, yeah, okay, we've been doing reasonably well, about 7%, 8%, but still 8% is a lot. And you have to do it for the foreseeable future. It's not like 1 or 2 years. You have to keep at it for a long time until this so-called, not only the new workforce that is entering the labor market, but also the backlog of workers that are not meaningfully employed can be absorbed over time. So it's a huge challenge that way. So I always have this question about how do you do this, and I'm not going to answer that question because I don't have one at the moment. But this is a real challenge in terms of India's employment situation. Now let's come to the automobile industry. All right. So they call it smart mobility, sustainable mobility as a service. So mobility is not about owning a car as an asset, but rather it is tending toward becoming a service. And that is, I'm talking about if you look at the sort of global technological frontier, which is largely in the rich countries. Sustainable mobility as a service. Now what contributes to that? One is that it's software-defined car. So there's a lot of software, I've already mentioned that. Sensors and big data. Okay, now if you specialize in data analytics, I can assure you'll get a job. Everybody's hiring data analytics, people with that kind of specialization. So they deal with large amount of data, and then they use it, using information technology, they use it for various purposes. The other is the connected car. So the car is not by itself an object, but rather the car is connected to many other different things. It could be connected to your home, it could be connected to your office, whatever. There are all kinds of things you can do these days with basically big data, sensors, and software. Now, the other thing is, of course, car sharing and driverless. Now, car sharing, of course, is relatively, increasingly becoming common. We have Ubers. Ubers are car sharing arrangements. So these days, more and more people are using Ubers, right? As opposed to having your own car, although probably the convenience is Uber, but status is something else. So status, of course, means having a car, your own car, right? But this kind of car sharing is going on, and there is also a tendency toward creating driverless cars. Now, this, of course, is a very interesting thing. Driverless cars. Even if we have a driver, it's a problem. But imagine having no driver at all, right? Especially on certain types of roads and cities and countries and so on. So there's but this is developing, technologically speaking, it is happening. Okay, it is happening. It's not a question of that, if, but rather when. That's the question. Electrification, I already mentioned about electrification. That electricity, that is battery technology, becomes very, very important part in this whole scheme of things. And then, of course, you have the so-called Internet of Things. So Internet of Things, the IoT, is basically connecting all these different devices. Various kinds of devices. Your phone can do a whole lot of things today. Okay? Whole lot of things. So these are the kind of new technologies that are emerging, and there are businesses, to some extent even governments are trying to combine these new technologies in some new ways. And in the end, what we are saying, of course, that is this, people who study the automobile industry, is that we're saying that a cluster of technologies are emerging which may drive the next cycle in some ways, all right? But it is a question of diffusion. So that's the thing. So the intervening variable here is diffusion. So how will the diffusion take place? That is the main sort of question. So if you look at, let's say, for India, so I took this information very recently from the Financial Times. Government of India previously said that 30% of all vehicles should be electric. Now all three-wheel by 2023. Now all two-wheel by 2025. So government's policies are shifting and they're trying to speed up the process somewhat. India's share of EVs, electric vehicles, is only 1%, China 2%, but obviously we'll see about China's projections. Norway 40%. Now Norway is a very small country, so obviously it's an outlier. Norway has lots of oil and yet they're moving into electric vehicles. So that's a different kind of thinking. Okay, they want to wean themselves away from oil. And the reason is very simple. Oil prices go up and down. Now, India, of course, the problem is that oil prices go up. There's a problem here, right? Oil prices decline. There are benefits, but it all depends on what the state of the oil industry is. And obviously, it's a very volatile kind of a situation. So, Norway has been very smart, and they said, well, we have lots of oil, but we're not going to rely on it. We're going to start moving ourselves. And of course, they're very concerned with the environment. If anybody's been to Norway, it's a very beautiful country. A very, very beautiful country. So I can understand their sentiments about not ruining the environment. Okay? So that's Norway. But China and India are the two very interesting cases. So China doesn't have any, only 2%. But obviously, China's 2% is a very large figure because China's automobile base is very large as well. In fact, China is the largest automobile market in the world. It is ahead of the United States now, right? So modest goals for EVs in India. So the question, of course, is the diffusion. This is, of course, the diffusion, and there are many factors as to that will determine the diffusion of, let's say, electric vehicles. So what do we have then? Okay, here's some diagrams about the diffusion of electric vehicles. So this is the global short-term passenger electric vehicle adoption by region. So both China and India are there. And what do you see? You can see that even in the short term, China is racing ahead in the adoption race of electric vehicles because they also have very severe air quality problems. But Delhi also has very severe air quality problems, but we don't see the same kind of urgency. If you take the long-term view of the electric vehicle adoption, then you do see that Europe, of course, does come up to China. Right? So Europe is doing it, but obviously they have a much longer term plan. But China remains ahead, but Europeans sort of move up very quickly because they are very, very environmental sort of conscious about, they are small countries, but they want to maintain the good quality air. They have a certain, sort of sentimentality about environment and so on. So Europe, US is there. But obviously, US over here is much slower. That's partly because US is very much internal combustion engine driven, even though there are many hybrid cars and so on. Because the US is a very large country, very, very large country. And the freeway system is something else. So you can drive from one end of the country to the other end, pretty much without any traffic lights, so to speak. Okay. Where does India stand? Well, okay, India's adoption rate will increase over time in the long term. So anyway, this is a scenario. It is simply a scenario to 2040. That's what we are looking at. So EVs, at least insofar as India is concerned, at least this data tells us, it's based actually on the Bloomberg, whatever the business press. Basically what they are saying is that, yeah, some countries will be faster, other countries will be slower in terms of their adoption. Okay, and India is going to be on the slow diffusion track. Now, if you look at automation, so I didn't talk very much about automation. I know Ramana Murthy talked a lot about automation, but I didn't talk a lot about automation. But automation is built into all of this whole industry, automation. What is automation? It's not simply the application of machinery to substitute labor. It is also more than that, in the sense that there are a lot of advantages to automating certain things, hazardous work, for example. But there's a considerable amount of automation taking place. And this automation is not simply mechanical ones, but also ones that are basically based on artificial intelligence. So AI. Now, one of the most popular examples of AI we have is when, what's his name, the chess player from the former Soviet Union who played the IBM computer, all right? So computers, you can program computers to play chess with the masters. So, which means that this artificial intelligence is one of those scientific kinds of activities which are increasingly trying to mimic human behavior in some limited way, all right? But they're getting smarter and smarter. That's the thing. So it's no longer, just a simple IBM machine playing chess, but the machine itself can predict pretty much all the moves that this opponent could make. And then based on that, can create all kinds of scenarios and beat this guy. It's possible, and they've done it. So this is, of course, it sounds ominous in some ways, because, if what you do is now done by robots or machines through automation, then obviously the jobs will be disappearing. And there are a lot of jobs that are actually slowly, gradually disappearing. The rule of thumb is that any job on the basis of, obviously, wage cost, labor cost, any job that is repetitious, mechanical, a machine can do it. That's it. Okay? Any job, pretty much. So if you look at Amazon, well, I'm sure you buy from Amazon India, but as you know, Amazon is a US-based company, actually from my city. If you think of Amazon, they move millions of dollars of goods every day. And the goods come from all over the place, including internationally. And then they deliver it to your home. If you have I don't know if in India they have the Prime subscription, but Prime, yes, so within 2 days they'll have it, right? Now sometimes they often deliver it within 1 day. How is all this possible? Well, computers. Computers, artificial intelligence, and automation. So their shelving within Amazon is all done by robots and so on. So what we find then, automation, again, the process of diffusion of automation, there is a faster track and there is a slower track, all right? But clearly then, the gap will be increasing over time in the immediate future. The gap will widen in terms of the diffusion or absorption of automation. So this scenario, of course, is for the early scenario, which means largely the rich, high-wage economies. It makes sense for a business to have automation in high-wage economies, simply on the basis of labor cost. Okay. The low scenario, of course, is this one, where probably India is likely to be. In fact, it might actually be even sort of much lower here. But there will be a big gap between the rich countries and the poor countries with regards to automation adoption over time. I am not going any further than 2050 because I can't, my mind is limited, so I cannot extend that. So too far in the future, so I don't speculate on this one.
Maybe the robot will.
Yes, that probably you can do that. Robots will probably do that. But you can have different sort of scenarios, early scenario, late scenario, and technical automation, of course. Again, there are two different kinds of scenarios, a low growth and a high rate of adoption in this case. But in any case, you're going to have also a gap increasing here between the early or the rapid absorbers and the late absorbers or the slow absorbers. There's going to be, so in many ways, this also represents in some ways a technological inequality globally. Yeah. So here is a car, nice looking car, is made in China, and it runs on a battery. A single charge will get you 515 kilometers. A single charge. So from here to Hyderabad to 500 kilometers will take you where? Coastal Andhra, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so far enough, one charge, right? So China is very much involved with this technology. Even though they have their traditional internal combustion based engines, they are really working in this because it's a question of, in this kind of a situation where new technologies are emerging, sometimes Or in fact, most of the times, if the perception is that this technology will take off in the near future, it is always to have the first comer advantage. The first comer advantage is when you get yourself in the industry and nobody can knock you out because you are already there. It's very, very difficult to knock you out. It's not that they can't be knocked out, because if you come up with a different product, smarter product, more efficient product, cheaper product, you can knock them out. But generally speaking, you need to be ahead. Now, because I talked about China, now this is a city in southern China, in Fujian, and it's known as Battery City. So all they do is, this particular company, CATL, Contemporary Amperex Technology Limited, they pretty much monopolize this city in making batteries. So yes, we can talk about, Hyderabad high-tech park doing all the back office stuff for foreign multinationals and the financial segment doing all the IT-related stuff, back office stuff. What they are doing, of course, is battery, because they know that if you control the battery market, then pretty much, you can have a command over the automobile industry. So it's going to be a very different kind of automobile industry, not your traditional type of automobile industry. So they have been investing like crazy and built an entire city to basically develop and manufacture batteries. So that's one aspect, battery. Then there's the question of car sharing, as I have said. Now, car sharing is an important concept. In India, Uber and Ola have over 700,000 vehicles, 2017, which was 300,000 a couple of years ago, and they expect about 1 million by 2018. Now, I don't know enough about the implications of this, other than to say that some taxis have been shunted out, maybe, or maybe the taxi drivers themselves have become Ola drivers and Uber drivers, but there has been an addition to employment with this kind of development, because more and more people now are taking Ubers and Olas because they're easy to get, they are convenient, you can pay them cash, you can charge it to a credit card, whatever. So there's a certain convenience attached to them. So it's a form of car sharing. So Uber and Ola are a form of car sharing because once you finished your ride, then somebody else gets it. You don't own it, right? So that's one thing. Now, there are other ways of car sharing, of course, is companies have cars sitting in different locations in the city. You have the app and you say, okay, there's a car over there for me, and you have signed up for this. You take the car, take it wherever you want, and then put it somewhere else. So this guy is looking up, and he could pick up the cars in these different places and drop it in some of those places. So again, now the thing to remember about car sharing is that because most of the time a car is idle, you drive, you reach your destination, then the car sits in the parking. And then in the evening, you take the car and come back home. So most of the time, the car is idle. So from a efficiency point of view, from a user point of view, or from a business point of view, so well, let's have the car, constantly in motion. People will use it. Now that obviously has certain implications because your output of cars then may drop if it really takes off. Okay, your output. So obviously there's that kind of implication. But also car sharing means, and especially because the car sharing is also taking on the new types of vehicles, that is battery charge. So you've got to have charging stations. And charging stations are here. Now, we talked about autonomous vehicles or self-driving or driverless cars. Now, who are the companies that are trying to do it? Not your traditional company, it's Apple. Now, what does Apple make? Phones. But they want to get into cars because they have the whole sort of internet cloud-based computing knowledge. And that's what will drive the car. Right? So you have Apple, of course I underline them, although there are some traditional players like Volvo. Volvo, you know who it's owned by, right? What's that? China, very good, yeah. So Volvo has been purchased, it was a Swedish company before. So it has been a long time Swedish company. China purchased it. Okay, Volvo, Uber. Now Uber itself is trying to create autonomous vehicles. So what will happen to the Uber drivers? So you won't have Uber drivers, you'll have driverless cars of Uber. So you'll call the app and a car without a driver will show up. Now that obviously has implications for certain countries. Okay, certain countries it will have implications in the sense that there might be an impact on the existing Uber drivers itself because they are developing autonomous vehicles. Waymo is a name that you may not have heard, but it actually belongs to Google. So Google obviously has the entire cloud-based technologies. So they are also, like Apple, they're thinking of. And then, of course, NVIDIA. I saw the back office of NVIDIA here in the high-tech park. NVIDIA makes chips. Not potato chips, your computer chips, right? So NVIDIA. Okay, so NVIDIA, they have no understanding, well, they have understanding, but they're not a traditional automobile manufacturer, but they're all into semi-conductors and that sort of thing. And yet they are thinking of autonomous vehicles and so on and so forth. But then China is also involved. Huawei is a public sector company of China. Okay. Huawei. And of course, they are in big trouble with the US, as you know, with the 5G technology. But they are also getting into autonomous vehicles. Baidu is a traditional Chinese automobile company, but they are also trying to get into this. So obviously, the market for these kinds of things is changing dramatically. So you cannot drive an autonomous vehicle in this kind of a system. Okay, this is from my favorite city, which is Calcutta, right? So how can you drive an autonomous vehicle in this kind of a system? So obviously that sort of is ruled out. But you could be using autonomous vehicles, perhaps, in these high-tech areas where the roads are wider. Probably there's a little more discipline in staying on the lanes. Maybe you might have some of that. But otherwise, autonomous vehicles is not for the immediate future as far as India is concerned. But in China, they could do it because they have excellent infrastructure. Very wide roads, pretty much in all the big cities. So it's possible, I'm just saying. But there are limits to, obviously, the diffusion of many of these technologies. Now, here, of course, you see this guy filling a car with regular petrol, filling station. So he's a worker. He has a regular job here. All right? It may not be very well paid, but he has a job. Here, a gentleman from India is charging his car. Now, he's the owner of the car, and he is charging it. This guy doesn't own the car, he's an employee, but he's charging somebody else's, filling the gas in somebody else's car. Now, if everybody, which I doubt it, but if every electric vehicle operator in India who owns an electric vehicle does their own charging, then what will happen to these guys? And where will they go? There is the number of people employed in these petrol pumps is massive in India. It's massive. So if this kind of thing happens, and the owner himself or herself is charging the car, these guys disappear. So that obviously has an implication.
I'm not sure what is the correlation with electric and petrol. Because I think in US, a large number of petrol stations, the owners serve themselves.
Yes, that's true. Because labor is too expensive.
Yeah, I think here also, because we have a surplus of labor, the process of actually charging the car involves similar labor.
It's possible in the sense that there will be people like him, charging your car. It's possible, and I am not ruling that out. But that's why there are different kind of possible scenarios here, right? So obviously, status is a very important thing. You get services done by everybody else. You don't do anything. Right? So somebody brings you something, somebody does that, very little of it is those who can afford to pay because labor is so cheap that you get things done by other people. You don't do it. So yes, it's entirely possible that this guy will be charging his car. I don't rule it out. But the different scenarios are possible here in terms of what might be the implication, because there are many, many people working in this gas filling stations in India, throughout India. Lots of them. Here's the charging station in China, and there's obviously they are aiming to be, this is a public charging station in Shenzhen. Shenzhen is southern China, very close to Hong Kong. South China's Guangdong province, as China's major cities, has reached an environmental milestone and almost all electric powered taxi fleet. So they are moving very, very fast, as far as China is concerned, even though they're expanding their other traditional automobile, ICE-based automobile production as well, but they're also moving in this sort of direction. And they have lots of incentives and disincentives, if you will. So you can't buy a car without a $12,000 permit in Shanghai. But if you buy an electric vehicle, it's waived, right? Now, obviously, you can say, but what if all the Chinese are pretty wealthy in Shanghai? Now, obviously, income is an issue here. And how do you enforce that part of it is also an interesting issue. But they have policies in place. Central government and other localities offer incentives that can hit $10,000 to $15,000 for having an electric vehicle. 300,000 public charging points compared to 67,500 in the United States. Some cities are going for 100% EV, and of course we mentioned about Shenzhen. And of course they have fairly large sort of projections in the next few years in terms of electric vehicles and hybrids. Now, there are obviously hybrids as well.
How fast is charging now?
How fast they take to?
That is one factor in electric vehicle.
Yeah, right.
See, what is happening is, even if we have electric vehicles, it takes anywhere between half an hour to 3 hours to charge. So, unless technology solves that problem, there may be other solutions like supercapacitors. But the plan is to have charged batteries, and either you or the worker swaps that. So that picture where people are putting wires and charging themselves, the scenario may be a little different from.
Yeah, there are lots of different scenarios regarding charging, who charges, what form of charge. No, but most cars actually these days, at least in the West, particularly some of the people that I know who have these electric vehicles, small electric vehicles, they charge them at home overnight. That's it. And their workplace is not that far, so that charge is good enough to take them to work and back.
But if I go to Bangalore, for example,
right,
and 500 kilometers is the range,
then you need the Chinese car.
It will still fast charge.
No, but the thing is that the battery technologies are improving. That's the thing. The battery technology, so it's not fixed yet. Yeah, there are obviously, a lot of costs involved for incremental improvement, for sure. But they are doing it because they know if you control the batteries, a lot of things can be controlled from a business point of view. All right, some final remarks. I won't spend too much time. We've already seen decoupling of economic growth from employment, massive employment challenge in India, and there is a double dilemma in jobs. That is, you need growth in productivity, which can be disruptive, because if you adopt lots of new technologies, it can be disruptive. But at the same time, there is a growth in labor force, which means that there is going to be a relative scarcity of jobs pretty much there. Job substitution, there are a lot of job substitution possibilities. Okay, in different sort of ways. We just touched upon a few. Different scenarios can be created. And we have also seen that when it comes to the long wave cycles that I talked about, that India needs to obviously make certain types of investments, new investments in the new paradigm or in the new techno-economic paradigm, but they also have to do a catch-up kind of process of infrastructure spending, a lot of infrastructure spending. I haven't read it in detail, but I believe recently Mr. Modi has announced some big plans for infrastructure spending. Although that in itself is not enough, there has to be many other things to be in place. But if you have, and also electricity, that is you need, as long as hydrogen is not yet available, hydrogen-powered cars, then electricity has to be generated still, and a lot of it will be demanded. So in this kind of scenario, because of substitutability, the employment prospects may not be as rosy, although there are some areas where employment will grow because new investments. The other, of course, is that disruption difficult to manage. Now, this is something more of a socio-political kind of question. In other words, politically, can you afford to have people on the streets? And that, of course, is something of a serious challenge. Because society will also respond. That if people are losing their jobs left and right, then obviously they'll say, well, maybe this is not what we want. So there is going to be a social response. We don't know exactly when that might be and how that might play itself out. So anyway, so that aspect is also something to be considered. So in the end, I think the next thing we can say, and of course I'm not making any kind of significant sort of conclusion, but simply saying that the adoption rate will be kind of different. It's going to be ad hoc policy. There are a lot of, in fact, India is very good at ad hoc policies. They all of a sudden say, tomorrow we want to go here, but they just never quite make it. They say a lot, but don't quite follow through because of state capacity and all of those. There are many other political variables that are associated with this. So inadequate state capacity, political dilemma, probably disruption by stealth. Now, yes, sometimes policies are introduced quietly. So by stealth, you can have some of those things, and that may happen. And then there could be some consolidation even in the much later, not now. Not typically when you adopt, and then you start consolidating. But in this case, you may adopt a few things, and consolidation may not actually happen because other things may have changed. So the rest of the economy, on the other hand, will be business as usual because that problem of abundant supply of workers. So this is, I think, going to be one of those things which will intervene very, very significantly as to how much of automation do you do. But when it comes to electric vehicles, yes, you can introduce them. The question, of course, is what will the business lobbies do? All right. So even though Mahindra is saying that we'll introduce electric vehicles, but obviously it may go against their immediate interests. So under late industrialization, then I think the issue is really a very, very difficult one because you have cumulative structural and policy failure under India's very specific form of late industrialization experience. So I say, but without elaborating, that we really need to think about mass transit systems. Thank you.
Various issues of the techno-economic paradigms. So for me, I could connect more of operations management, technology management, and economics. Because in operations management, we first thinking about how we can improve the efficiency of the systems, how we can cut down the cost, cycle time reduction, waste reduction. But we are silent about how many people are going to lose their jobs. So that I think today we have seen how this technology is going to have its impact on employment. We have touched upon various issues about the transition, booms, depressions, long wave, then cyclical behavior, mass production. Then we also spoke something about IC engine. So here we also see a lot of things when you are referring to. And I used to recall STD booths. In my childhood, we used to have a lot of STD booths, but now it is nowhere available. Like photo studios. We used to have a lot of photo studios. I think hardly now photo studios are there.
Everybody is taking their own pictures.
Yes. So this is how it is. But we touched upon only automotive industry, but technology, even this online banking, online booking of tickets. So if you look at that way, I don't know how it's going to have its impact on employment, especially in a country like ours. And we are now struggling for jobs now. So a lot of students who are graduating from colleges and universities. There's huge competition for few hundreds of seats, positions, lakhs of people are appearing for the exam. That once we bring this kind of technology into place, what would be the future consequences we are afraid of? Probably taking some clue from you, you're only little optimistic that the substitute jobs are available. So that's where. So with this note, now I would like to open the floor for question and answer sessions. Please, yeah.
About automotive industry particularly, what are the possible impacts on employment due to the changes taking place in this paradigm and technology? I think you have put very coherently and cogently. Now, it what occurs that to look at the even longer waves, say in technological changes over time and economic changes over time, transportation costs have played an enormous role. Or is it a communication of the materials as well as vehicles. Now, if I see from that point of view, suppose linkage I have not explored at all, like that, this is going to make things cheaper. This is going to cut down on costs. certain activity and then we stimulate them. That component is not talked about. So if you like to touch upon that.
Sure. Yes, I mean, thank you for that question. Obviously, that any economic activity will have some intersectoral linkages with other sectors, and of course, automobile industry as such has the traditional automobile industry has a lot of linkages, and if you bring it up to the sort of the sixth Kondratieff cycle, that is the most recent one, if you will, then in that case we can begin to see that battery technology, Internet of Things, driverless cars, autonomous, big data, computations, all of these things are sort of coming together in some ways and probably will be the ones driving it. Now, one of my colleagues, of course, he asked me the question, but why are we so worried about jobs? Because the horse buggy was there, it disappeared, and actually more people got employed after that, right? And I agree. So the question becomes: do you take a view that maybe we don't need to worry too much or not? But having said that, yes, in some cases, especially in smaller countries with tight labor markets, you can expect that maybe new sectors would emerge, and they do. So Norway, traditionally a kind of a primary sort of resource-based economy. I mean, what was that Norwegian telecommunications company that didn't make it in the end? Telenor, I think. There was a time, right? But somehow they have branched into Finland, a small country with Nokia. They wood and paper and pulp producing country, but they have transformed themselves. So new activities can emerge, and that is also the case for India. There could be new kinds of occupations. In fact, the occupation categories are changing these days. Your traditional, categories, whatever we have, they are actually disappearing, and they call them something else. But that's because they're probably doing multiple different things, but as if they are part of a single sort of skill-based package, right? So I agree that there will be other types of sectors that probably would emerge and could emerge. I mean, India does have that particular strength when it comes to, let's say, software. So maybe, Indians, engineers sitting in high-tech city will be driving autonomous cars in the United States remotely. That's possible. You can remotely drive cars from here. You can do that. All you need is all the Google Maps and everything will be there, and you can do it. So that would be a new occupation. Basically, it will be car-less drivers.
I was linkage that you talked about. I was talking about that it makes some activity directly stimulated by the cheaper transportation costs.
Okay. But the cheaper transportation, the thing is that, electric vehicles, yes, there are some cheaper versions of it, and others are actually quite expensive. Even your ordinary cars, although maybe not so much in the US, not so much in India, but say in the US, cars are, yes, you have the option of buying a used car, which is quite good actually. But the cars as such, new cars are actually quite expensive. The prices actually have not fallen. Now, they may have fallen relative to your income. They may have somewhat fallen. But cars are expensive. And also the other thing I have noticed, although this is only anecdotal, that a lot of people are buying expensive cars. So they're driving Audis and Mercedes-Benz, which they may not have been doing so. So I think unlike, say, electronics, where the prices have kept on falling and falling and falling, in the automotive industry, the prices don't seem to fall as much. Or at least I have not really seen that much of a decline in prices. And that's partly because the cost of making the cars may have fallen somewhat, but they are also adding a lot of things into the car. So thereby keeping the prices more or less unchanged from time to time. But if we find, say, hydrogen in the end, that will drive your cars, probably it might just bring it down considerably. We don't know. So, but then it's not in the interest of businesses necessarily to reduce the cost. Why would they want to, right? They can only reduce the cost so that their markup remains a certain amount. But other than that, it is in their interest to make sure that they get the market and they have the upper hand in some ways. But reducing the costs for cars, I think, is still, we have some ways to go. There are some cars like the Nissan Leaf. I don't know if they are sold in India. It's a battery, small car. It's not very expensive. Nissan Leaf, it's called, and it's run on a battery, basically. It's not a hybrid, just a battery. So there are some cars that are cheap, relatively cheap, I would say, compared to a regular internal combustion engine type of a car. But of course, and I didn't talk about it, but I left with that note, is that I think you need mass transit system. That's what we need, not talking about individual mobility.
Mr. Rajaram.
There may be a disruption in some other ways, especially for India, especially with respect to electric cars. Already, if you see the journals and if you discuss automotive industry, in the next 1 or 2 years, there are cars ranging from about 6 lakhs to 25 lakhs, they will be in the market. People are working on it. Right. Tata's and this thing already have almost commercial prototypes ready. Okay. So but the disruption I am talking about is that India wakes up to the fact that its potential for solar energy is enormous, and the economy is so dependent on things like oil imports,
right.
And the solar energy has a ability to completely disrupt our export-import that equation. So if something drastic happens on that front, then suddenly this electric car vehicles are something which can easily adapt to that scenario.
Right.
So I think that in the next 50 years that might happen. I mean, it could.
Right. I mean, I have not looked into this.
It's not something which is advantageous for, let's say, Norway.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here we have a lot of free resource, which is
right. I mean, I'll be honest with you though. I went to college in Rajasthan in the 1970s. All right, and we had actually solar panels in those days. And obviously, it has for a long time it just nothing happened. It was never seen as this alternative source of energy, even though people were working on solar energy at the time, because Rajasthan has plenty of sun, as you know. Maybe too much sun, I don't know.
That's the point. Too much sun. So if you can take away that energy for something else.
Right. No, I mean, I think India is as a late industrializing country, I don't think it will put all its eggs in any one energy basket. It will always be multiple sources, but the pressure too, at a global level at least, and from a quality of life point of view, the pressure is to reduce its dependence on coal and other fossil fuel. And fossil fuel, that is imported oil, because imported oil also creates its own problems. There's geopolitical implications in all of this. So in some sense, of course, yes, finding a substitute for oil would be a real benefit in some ways, because some of these countries that control the oil, they become irrelevant. Right? So obviously there is a lot of political lobbying, back office kind of things going on as to what is the next energy source and how it's going to be diffused or not diffused. I think there's a lot of that kind of stuff. I mean, I sound like a movie, the conspiracy type of movies, but actually it is there. I can assure you it is there.
Yes, please.
So carrying on this clean and efficient mass transit system, Mr. Nitin Gadkari is planning on introducing Skybus, which will be charged with the solar panels and everything. A similar system has been introduced in Australia as well. And since you've been in Australia, can you enlighten us on how the Skybus system has affected Australia?
I don't recall actually taking a Skybus, in at least while living in Melbourne. Because I relied on, I like walking. So my footprint, at least on when I'm living, my footprint is, energy footprint is very, very small. So I took the public transportation systems, largely, trams. They have trams in Melbourne, and they have buses, and then they have trains if you're going outside the city. So and then of course you have taxis and Ubers. You have those as well. So I'm not so sure. In fact, the only Skybus that I can think of was the one that went to the airport, I think. Yeah, so it wouldn't have made a huge of an impact yet, although I have to say though that Australian government is quite enthusiastic about solar energy. So households actually have, and they get credit for generating electricity. So that is there for sure. So individual households have solar panels generating the electricity, and they actually get credit for it, which means they're, obviously it's not a complete source, because they still have to get from the grid, the regular grid. So which means then they get compensated for the electricity they generate as some kind of an incentive. So that is catching on in Australia for sure.
Sir, it's a more small submission, sir. This is a theoretical question. Sir, can we say that it is a paradigm? Can we use the analytical tool called paradigmatical shift when we are talking about technological shift? Because paradigm shift is more of in science. It means when you theoretical break happens, then we studied in sociology that it's called a paradigm shift. And when you are when you have said that long waves and you use it, the paradigm shift is supposed to be a science theoretical breakup. Can we use this kind of analytical tool in explaining technology, sir?
Yes, I think you can. I mean, paradigm basically means a framework. It's really a framework. So frameworks do change, and although in the social sciences, certainly the frameworks don't change in a very drastic way, because there's always a kind of a legacy of previous kinds of frameworks, which then add on to, let's say, a novel kind of framework. So it's never a distinct break. In science, perhaps you may have those kinds of breaks. In a typical sort of scientific inquiry, you may have those typical kind of breaks. But in this case, I also would say that yes, I think you can use it only because the framework, that is, the framework is a very large one, and it encompasses not just the technological, not just the economic, but there are political, social, and even cultural dimensions associated with this possible sort of shifts in the ways by which we use the automobile industry, the way it is powered, the way we share, the new types of technologies that are being used, and so on. So there's a lot of, and even from a policy point of view, there will be shifts in all of this. So if, of course, all of those changes take place, then I think it would be a break of some sort from the previous paradigm, dependent on, let's say, internal combustion engine, mass production, owner-driven car, etc., etc. So there will be a shift. It hasn't happened, no. It has not happened, but some of it will happen, some of it is happening. So I think we can use that if we use the word paradigm in terms of a framework over which there is a consensus. What is a paradigm? In the end, there has to be a consensus. A scientific paradigm becomes a paradigm only when there is a consensus. So there is a certain kind of consensus emerging. It's not quite there, but it's emerging. So yes, I think we can use it.
Yes, please.
Sir, when you consume a car, it's a matter of behavior. It's a matter of behavior of the consumer. You see the nano car, which is more cheaper, but not people are not using these days. If you see the bike, most of the bike today is less average, giving less average as compared to high average bike. So how you think on this perspective? How the consumer behavior on this automatic car?
Well, good question actually. The consumer behavior, there are already shifts in consumer behavior in the sense that certainly in some of the wealthier countries, for a long time the automobile was the sort of classic middle class product, all right? And which means that there was a certain kind of ownership attached to it. You drive everywhere, you give you a certain kind of freedom and liberty. Right? But today people are becoming increasingly conscious about the environment. So they're willing to actually give up their car, rely more on public transportation, but they're also willing to share. So the idea that you don't own a car, but then a company has a number of cars spread out throughout the city and you simply use it as you need it, which means that you're also giving up that ownership dimension of it. So I think there are increasingly there are certain types of behavioral changes that are also expected to occur for sure. Again, the question, of course, is how much and when will all of these take place? But yes, people's attitudes are toward the car itself is changing. In fact, for a long time, if you were a smoker, people looked at you. These days, if you drive your own car burning fossil fuel, they'll look at you. You see what I'm saying? So there are certain attitudinal shifts taking place gradually. People are becoming more and more concerned about the environment, the carbon footprint, and all of those kinds of things. And this particular industry, automotive industry, has a huge role to play. Huge role. From every facet you can think of, from public policy to electrification, to consumption, to production, etc., etc., etc. Lots of changes. But some of them obviously will take a longer time to come into different places. Obviously, India will be a different kind of scenario compared to, let's say, Norway or Denmark or wherever that might be. I was in Paris during this thing. I saw many cars parked. They're all car sharing, and they were all parked next to a charging point. It's becoming, common. Increasingly becoming common. So that's a behavioral change, I think, from a consumer point of view.
Yeah. Yes, please. She took the mic. Yeah. Mishra, she took the mic.
If you see the historical perspective in the operations area, sir, till 1980s, there was not much talk about quality in the automotive industry. So when it started in 1924, W.A. Sheward in US, the later came Deming in 1950s, and he moved to Japan for training those CEOs and scientists and engineers. But till such time, again 30 years later, almost till late 1980s, there was not much talk about the quality in the automotive industry. I don't know what could be the reason behind it. Was there something political, or maybe there are some other issues? Because the Motorola company started in 1980s, then why the automotive industry didn't react so much to the quality and the Six Sigma kind of stuff?
But you're referring to the Indian automobile industry? Global industry?
Global industry, yes.
No, I mean, I think I would sort of have a slightly different view from yours, and that is the automobile industry that was based on mass production systems, right? So pretty much all big companies, especially in the United States and in Western Europe, they were heavily dependent on economies of scale. They had large markets, growing markets, so they just went with that sort of production system. But at the same time, in Japan, things were done very, very differently. In fact, why is it that Mr. Deming was invited by Japanese companies and not by the American companies when Mr. Deming himself was an American, right? So obviously, to the American producers, car producers, they did not think that his ideas were anything radical or significant. But the Japanese kind of figured it out that, well, actually, he's saying some sensible things, and maybe we need to sort of listen to him, and they did. And of course, you have to also understand that you have to take the particular Japanese context in which the automobile industry arose. So there's a certain context to it. So they produced also very different types of vehicles. Small vehicles, for example, right? Small vehicles because they have narrow streets, all sorts of reasons. So, but the thing is that and especially Toyota, they were doing a lot of incremental. Japanese are known for their incremental innovations. So they were doing a lot of incremental innovations. So by the time the Japanese export products started showing up on a large scale in the global economy, everybody was shocked. They didn't know that, they were doing something different. The American companies were very big. So General Motors, let's say. General Motors, massive company. Ford, and then there was Chrysler. These were the three big players for a long time. And so they were very complacent in the sense that they didn't think anybody could really challenge them. And initially, the Japanese cars that showed up on the US market, they were not particularly great. But these guys, they believe in learning. They make a mistake and they go back to the drawing board. That's their approach. And the Koreans do the same thing. So even the Korean cars, the Hyundai was like a hopeless car in the US. Nobody was accepting it. Then they went back to the drawing board. Started doing things with it. Then they started giving a 10-year warranty. 10-year or 100,000-mile warranty. Now, who would give you such a warranty if they were not sure of their product? right? So they obviously did a lot of this improvements and incremental learning. And of course, what the Japanese were doing, the Kaizen and everything else, yeah, the US, they didn't, they had their own systems in place. But once the competition started, then the American companies also started introducing those, but slowly, those diffusion of those best industry practices out of Japan were being diffused. And of course, they also diffused to a great extent in some of the Indian factories as well.
So we have last question. Yeah, please.
May not be, you have spoken specific to automobile industry, and I'm sure therefore the problem of unemployment, implications on unemployment still look partial, because when we looked about overall unemployment, will come from the automation that simultaneously takes place at different industries. And that's what perhaps drives us, the fears of what will happen next. In this context, maybe it may not be totally out of context if I say that developing countries and developing countries both are going to face this challenge. They are looking, at least there's a talk about the basic income transfer as some kind of alternative to take care of the problem if so many people are going to be laid off. But this automation is going to create so much prosperity, and therefore a part of it can be transferred back to everyone, every citizen, so that some kind of the basic consumption is always sustained. And it is perhaps easier for the developed countries to think about. Many European countries, there are 8 million people, 4 million people, 10 million people, and therefore maybe it is quite possible for them even to think about it. But a similar discourse also is coming in India, which is not a basic income transfer as such, because basic income, if you define the way Europeans have done, we need 80% of GNP to be transferred, which is not possible. So therefore what they are talking is a poverty level of income, which is a part of it, 2%, 3% of GNP that can be transferred as a dole, etc. So therefore you have this, the dual economy, which is going to continue, where you have the only organized sector of 3% or 4% and large number of people unemployed in the vulnerable informal sector, who are going to be maintained by a small transfer like JNREJ so far, like a PDS so far. There could be. So question is whether these are they going to be sustainable, or how to think about them? I'm just asking you to react. Not a very specific question as such, because it's not possible to give a concrete question.
Right. Yes. The notion of basic income, minimum income, all of these things have become part of the sort of discourse today in lots of different places. Even in the United States, they're talking about this kind of a thing, that basic income. Now, the thing is that at one level, the idea seems actually quite interesting. But the question, of course, is that whether by itself whether it will actually make any huge difference or not, depending again on the context, is questionable, in the sense that if you give, say, $1,000 or $1,500 to every American, right? $1,500 is not going to do very much to you, because the cost of living is very, very high. But it could be a kind of a palliative, in the sense that your basic nutrition sort of stuff is required, and then there are other kinds of benefits. Of course, the whole idea behind the basic income is that essentially capitalism is an exclusive system. It cannot include everybody in the same way. I mean, it incorporates everybody, but some at an advantage and others at a disadvantage. So that we know, and that's part of your uneven development. So in some ways, it's an admission that, well, we've got to think of something else. But I think there are some other kinds of things. And of course, Piketty's argument, if you think about it, most people actually talk about redistribution. It's a question of how to redistribute society's resources. And one of the important instruments that we have, especially certainly in the richer countries, is through taxation. So how much do you tax? So, for example, yes, I know Finland is a very small country, but Finland fines you for speeding on the basis of your income. So, if somebody is a millionaire, guess what his fine would be? Okay, so they have obviously internalized this notion of egalitarianism to the point where they do these very interesting kinds of things. So, but these are small countries, agreed, and they obviously have a very high standard of living, but they are also coming under challenge in part because, the numbers are increasing, particularly of immigrants, and oftentimes they are not contributors to society, at least that's how it is perceived. And so there could be a burden on the exchequer of some sort. How to maintain that standard of living is the question. But they already have a relatively good redistribution system. In the US, no. In the US, they don't believe in redistribution. They believe that everybody has the same opportunity, so you make it on your own. So that's the kind of, but it's not working. And so that's why you have increasingly more and more debate and discourse about distribution and inequality in the United States. Even if the standard of living on the average is high, but there are a lot of people well below the average standard of living in the United States. So this has become an issue, and of course the politicians are picking this up, particularly the Democratic politicians. So this is one thing, redistribution. But directly relevant to what I've been also saying is that if, let's say, you start introducing robots, not just in the automotive industry, but across different types of industries, so then the question becomes, do you levy a tax on the robot? And why shouldn't you? So if every company starts introducing robots, they should pay taxes, just like a worker would have paid taxes. Because in the end, those countries that are adopting robots, especially countries that are aging very rapidly, so they are out of the workforce, but they still want to produce more, and automation also helps in keeping their economy going, particularly, let's say, in Japan. There's a lot of robotics used for elderly populations for various things, including they have, by the way, nurses, which are robots, right? So the question then is that, but then the thing is that in order to support your elderly population of the society, somebody has to pay taxes. You have to have workers. But if the workers are being replaced by robots, then why not impose a tax on the robots? And this idea is there. It's not, I'm not talking, it's not my idea. It's actually in the discussion. So there are ways by which I think you can think of redistribution. And I have to say that this is going to be the future political discussion everywhere, is redistribution. Because nobody is talking, obviously, of, changing the entire system and having a revolution. They've been tried. And of course, it doesn't quite work in the way you think it would work. No. But redistribution within the capitalist system is increasingly becoming a political sort of force. And I think at some level it will have to happen in some form because the public is upset. The public is upset with that, especially because the inequality has become worse.
Thank you very much, sir. As a token of gratitude and remembrance, we would like to present you a memento on behalf of the university.
Offer my own thanks on behalf of the University School of Economics. The biggest takeaway for me is to look from multiple points of view towards a problem. In fact, that's what is extremely exciting about this, and I thank the speaker. I thank Professor Rajshekhar for coming and presiding. I thank the Dean Economics, Naresh, for being cooperative right from the beginning. I proposed the idea, and thanks to all of you for coming and making the success. Thank you.